Emor, which is in the book of Leviticus, and it begins in chapter 21, verse 1. And I'm going to actually begin at the beginning of Emor, and then I'm going to skip to discuss two issues that this parsha raises, which are both issues that are tremendously important and actually tie into the discussion that we were having just before the camera came on, because there are real live people here and you actually speak to them even before the camera comes on, as opposed to everything coming to life just for the camera. I was saying that COVID has had this resurgence, and we were talking about the fact that it's much more like a cold now than like a life-threatening thing, although there are all sorts of protocols in place for COVID that aren't in place for other kinds of things. I mean, people always used to come to work with colds, but now if someone comes to work with COVID, then I think according to the CDC, you're supposed to stone them and curse them and bury them in the sand. So I don't know if in that order, it could be a different order, but this and this question of how you react around disease and death is constant in the Torah, because obviously the Torah was written at a time when the only possible real reaction to a disease was prayer and sacrifice. And I remember reading once, I can't vouch for this, but I remember reading it, that I can vouch that I once read it, that it wasn't until about 1900 that when you went to a doctor, your chances of being helped were greater than your chances of being harmed. So for most of human history, medicine was not particularly helpful. You might as well just pray. And Emor begins with death. And we know that Aaron has just gone through a death because his children, two children have died. And Moses speaks to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and says, you shouldn't defile yourself for any among your kin except for basically immediate family. And then it goes on to say, you shouldn't shave your head or make gashes in your flesh. And the first part, as you may know, is Kohanim, priests to this day, do not go into cemeteries according to Jewish law except for immediate family. And the second part, about not making gashes, has a lot to do with the Jewish attitude towards death, which is that the ones who are alive are still alive, and they're not permitted to harm themselves because someone else has died. And that's why when you come back from a funeral, you have the Su'udat Ha'avara, the meal of transition, which is supposed to help you come back to life, because death is an inevitable accompaniment of life. And if you mourn too much, then what you do is bring death into life, into everyday life. And the reason that I brought up the pandemic at the beginning is one of the reasons why I think Judaism is able to limit the mourning so, I think, healthfully, but also strictly. You only say Kaddish for 11 months. You can't actually say it for longer, according to Jewish law. You only sit Shiva for 7 days. You only do Shloshim for 30 days, is because death was not an uncommon occurrence in ancient times. People died all the time, and they died in front of other people. They were not whisked away to hospitals and sealed off so that you didn't know or understand them. And when death is an accompaniment of life, I think you learn how to handle it better than when death is not. And also because we live much longer, we live healthier. Death seems to us an anomaly as opposed to the natural part of life that everybody goes through. And part of that is obviously a good thing, a wonderful thing, because that's because of advances in medicine and so on and so forth. But over the last 10 to 20 years, I did a podcast yesterday that's not out yet with Plaza, which is a mortuary service in New York that does a lot of outreach, a Jewish one. And we were talking about the fact that hospice has returned death to modern society because now people die at home, which was really rare. When I started out in the rabbinate, almost nobody died at home. Now it's very common. I mean, not always, obviously. It depends what you die of and what your particular situation is, but it's not uncommon for people to actually see people whom they love die, which in the ancient world was ubiquitous. People did it all the time. And so the beginning of this discussion is about death and the reality of death and the way in which death affects not just priests but everybody, and how much you're not allowed to react to death by cutting off the beauty of your own life. The second part of this that I wanted to mention, and this is why at the beginning, before I think those of you who are online were here, I said this class is about death and gratitude, is in the next chapter, chapter 22, verse 21. It says, "And when a man offers from the herd or the flock a sacrifice of well-being to the Lord for an explicit vow," is that the one? One second. One I'm looking for. I'm looking for the Thanksgiving sacrifice. Where did it go? Oh, there we go. Verse 29, forgive me. Verse 29. I knew it was close. When you sacrifice a thanksgiving offering to the Lord, sacrifice it so it may be acceptable in your favor. It shall be eaten on the same day. You shall not leave any of it to the morning. I am the Lord. So the question is, why does a thanksgiving sacrifice have to be eaten the same day? Sacrifices can stay over the next day or 2 days. They didn't immediately go bad. And there are a lot of very beautiful explanations for this, two of which I want to highlight. One is that you eat it the same day because it's a lot. First of all, you sacrifice a lot. You don't just sacrifice one thing. You sacrifice many animals for a Thanksgiving offering, which means that it's more than any one person can consume. Now, if you leave it for a couple days, you could eat it by yourself, right? Leftovers last a couple days in the fridge. You can finish them by yourself. But if you have to finish them that day, what do? You got to invite other people over. And Thanksgiving is, just like Thanksgiving in America in a different sense, it's a communal thing. It's hard to be thankful alone the way you can be thankful with other people. So the first explanation is the reason you don't leave it to the next day is because you want to share your gratitude with others, because joy that is shared is much more moving than that which you have alone. An answer that I like even better, although that one's wonderful too, and I don't have to put the answers in a hierarchy. An answer that I like even better, and this one ties back in some ways to the question of death, is the reason that you eat a Thanksgiving offering the same day, and a Thanksgiving offering usually celebrates some miracle or some beneficence that has been done for you, is because you believe there will be another one tomorrow. That is, if you give the Thanksgiving offering and you say, I got to make this last for a few days, it's because you don't think tomorrow is going to bring another occasion of a Thanksgiving offering. You had a miracle and that's it. But if you have faith in life, you say, you know what, this was today's Thanksgiving offering, but that doesn't mean that there won't be tomorrow's Thanksgiving offering. And this is a very, I don't want to, God knows I'm the last person on earth, really the last person on earth who should give anyone financial advice. So I'm not giving this as financial advice, please. Um, I mean, like, let me just put it this way. 6 months ago, I bought some Bitcoin. So you don't want me to give you financial advice. But the idea, the mentality of only saving and never spending is the mentality of is the opposite mentality of the Thanksgiving offering. The notion that I have to save because tomorrow is going to be terrible, and because you never know what's going to happen. And how many people do you know? I mean, to me, it is like, unless you have people in your life who need it, who will get it. To me, it's like a crime and a sin to die rich. You shouldn't die rich, right? It's not bad to be rich, but that money should be doing something in the world in the course of your life. And people who hold on to it without any, we just disappeared on the screen. I don't know if that matters. But people who hold on to it without ever giving it away or spending it have the mentality of that is the opposite of the Thanksgiving offering. That is, they don't believe in the abundance of life. And so, as I said, please do not take this as financial advice. I could surround that with as many disclaimers as possible because I know less than nothing about how money works in the world. Everything I know about how money works, I got from the novels of Balzac, which is probably not the best source for the 21st century. But I do know that there are people who have a mentality of tight-fistedness because they're terrified if they open their fists, like everything will disappear. And that probably comes from childhood, but it's a very unfaithful and untrusting attitude towards life. And I think that the Torah is trying to say that there is always more. There's always more, that the world is very full, and that it's better to live, even if, as will inevitably happen, if you live with an idea of abundance, you will end up wasting things and spending things that you shouldn't have spent. And you'll look back and say, you know, why did I buy the Bitcoin? You will. But the truth is that's still better. It's still better to live that way than to say, gee, you know, I mean, I'll put it a different way. It's like the numbers on a sheet shouldn't be what give you psychic satisfaction. And too many people, unfortunately, as opposed to what they can do in the world, how they can celebrate, how they could live, how they could entertain the people they love, how they could give to tzedakah, how they could do all those things, feel better if the numbers are higher on the balance sheet. And that's a shame, in a way. It's a shame because it cuts them off from a lot of joy that they could have in the world. And the reason that it matters is because life ends. If you lived forever, so I would understand saving, but we all have a limited time. And so because this parsha starts off by reminding us that everybody dies, and therefore you should live, as the psalmist says, Lo amut ki echyeh, I will not die but live. And the Hasidic commentary on that isn't that redundant? What does that mean, I will not die but live? Aren't those two things the same? And he says, no, they're not the same. There are people who are not dead, but they're not living. And you have to live while you're alive as opposed to not live. And so I think that's the Emor lesson for this morning, and happy to take questions, comments, discussion. Sophie, okay. That's okay. About anything. Anything. Sure. Okay. Well, let me repeat the question. And I actually just taught a whole class on this yesterday, in fact, a different class. The question was, the question is, if the Torah, according to modern scholars, isn't written by God, why is it holy? And what I would say is there's a vast range of views in the Jewish world about how the Torah came to be. And I'll give you like several possibilities. One is that the Torah is literally the word of God to Moses at Sinai. By the way, the reason that that's hard even for the most traditional person to believe is if God actually told Moses everything in the Torah at Sinai, then Moses already knew that Korach was going to rebel against him later on in the desert, right? So that one doesn't work very well. The second is that the Torah was a process of continuing revelation. That's what Ramban, Nachmanides, says. So it wasn't just one moment at Sinai, it was something that happened over a period of time. The third is that, and this is the closest to that the Torah was given to Moses, but over time, in transmission, things happened that changed the Torah, changed the text, so on. It wasn't kept. There were wars, there were copyists, there were difficulties, and errors crept in, okay? Those are, I would say, the three most traditional views. Then you move to the Torah is a collaboration between God and human beings. So there are things in it that are from God, and there are things in it that are from people. And since it happened over a long period of time, you've got both. Then there is, the Torah is a product of the people's experience of God. And what that means is that the Torah is written by people who had this direct vision and experience of God, but it was written by people. So it still has, it's divinely inspired, basically. So it still has God in it, but it's only human. The least traditional view is that it was just written by people and it's just a cultural document like anybody else's cultural document. And I think if you believe that, then your only answer is because I love Jewish traditions and the Jewish people and want to keep it. But most people, I think, who have some kind of deep Jewish connection believe in some way God is present in the Torah, even though not literally word for word in everything. So, but this is, as you can imagine, this is ever since the modern period, this is something that has been endlessly discussed and debated, and there isn't any very easy, clear answer to the question. So. Yeah. You want here, why don't you take the.
Also, the sacrifices to the gods were definitely a feast for the many, and so those are long traditions.
Yes, they are both long traditions. Jim was saying that first of all, when Achilles is chided for mourning too long for his friend Patroclus, he gives him his armor and then he dies in it. That's similar to this. In a certain way it is. Of course, there it's because they want Achilles to get up and fighting again. And there is, I suppose that there is that metaphorical idea, which is you want people to return to life again. And it is easy to retreat from life in mourning. As we've all seen during the pandemic, when you have an excuse, even if it's a sad excuse, to cut yourself off from life, it can be hard to rejoin life again. It really can. Just like for some people, even when they're in situations that don't possibly pose any risk, it's really hard not to wear a mask. They just, once you go into a certain kind of hiding, sometimes it's very hard to emerge. And also, yes, sacrifices, there are like various theories about this. René Girard has a famous theory about this, but about sacrifice basically being a fundamental human need. And that if you watch popular culture, for example, what we call cancel culture or the way people are attacked or so on is part of that same impulse, which is to sacrifice someone else or something else so that you will be okay. And it does feel like that sometimes. It feels like when people attack other people online, it feels like they're saying, okay, if I attack them, I'm okay. We'll sacrifice this guy and I'll be all right. And it is this purging of yourself by seeing someone, or in this case, I mean for animals, something else suffer so that you don't have to suffer. Almost as if the world is the kind of place where something has to die and something has to suffer. And if it's someone else, then it's not me. Then it's not me. So I think that is probably goes very deep into human nature. And as you say, not only is it in Greek culture and all the ancient pagan cultures and every culture we've ever found. We've never found one without sacrifice. And as you know, in some of them, they sacrificed humans, right? The Mayans did, the Canaanites did, right? It was a development. This is what Maimonides says. Maimonides says that the reason God allows sacrifices, and by the way, people attacked Maimonides for this. I'll tell you why in a second. He says the reason God allows sacrifices is because Israel was used to people making human sacrifices, and he had to wean them off of that. And you couldn't just say, okay, no more sacrifice, because that would be too dissonant with the world. Everybody in the world sacrificed, so he had them sacrifice animals. The reason that got Maimonides in trouble, in part, is because he was suggesting that it was a stage along the way, and one day we wouldn't need sacrifices anymore, and the more traditional authorities didn't like that suggestion, because God said you sacrifice, and God doesn't give provisional, advice. So, but in any case, I do think that sacrificial impulse is very deeply embedded in us. And that's why, by the way, Girard, who was a religious Christian, he says that's why Christianity put it at the center of the Christian religion, is now that God has sacrificed God's self, we're really okay. We're really okay. But that doesn't mean that sacrifice doesn't still exist. That sacrificial impulse doesn't still exist in us. And as I said, we see it play out virtually every single day in our world. We're always doing something at the expense. Yeah, Stanley.
Is prayer became a substitute for
Yeah. Prayer without.
like worshiping something?
So, okay, let's close with these two questions. First of all, could tzedakah be a substitute for prayer? The reason I think tzedakah is a substitute for sacrifice. Tzedakah is in part, but I think the reason that it's not a full substitute is that it's not given to God. Tzedakah is given to another person. So you have to do something that also is directed upward, and prayer is directed upward, and that it's hard. I agree. Prayer is a kind of pale substitute in a way for sacrifice, because a sacrifice is powerful and cathartic and dramatic, and prayer isn't always that way. I mean, if you raise an animal, and if you read that book that we were talking about before, From Africa to Zion, he says as a little kid, he was so close to all the animals that he raised. He knew them from the time they were born, and he knew their habits, and they were not just a flock to him. He knew every one of them. And then one day you take that animal, and you put it on an altar in the temple, and not in the book, but I'm saying in ancient times, and you sacrifice it. So that's really powerful. So it is a substitute for sacrifice, but I think not a full one. And whether you can have prayer without prayer, that is, without a direct address of God, I think depends on what you think of as prayer. If you think of prayer as just poetry, yes, It's the same. But if you think of prayer as expressing yourself to someone or something, however you want to define God, then poetry isn't sufficient. You're speaking to someone. Prayer is a kind of dialogue, even though we do most of the talking. So, yeah. Yeah. Not online. It wasn't online. Yeah, no, unfortunately. But maybe we'll do a separate one on that. Maybe we'll do a class on philosophy and revelation. I have in the past. Maybe I'll do the next lunch and learn on that. How about that? I will do the next lunch and learn, which is, we still have one left, I believe. Yeah? Okay, so the last, is it the last of the year or the second to the last of the year, lunch and learn will be about Revelation, and it will be online as well as in person, and we'll see you then. Thank you.